As per Ind AS 115, there are 5 steps which are required to be fulfilled in order to recognize the revenue. To recognize that revenue, all the 5 steps need to be fulfilled. Under that, step number 1, identify the contract or contracts with the customer. Step number 2, identify the separate performance obligations in the contract. Step number 3, determine the transaction price. Step number 4, allocate the transaction price to the separate performance obligations. Step number 5, recognize revenue as and when the entity satisfies a performance obligation. As per step number 1, there should be an enforceable contract with the customer. The contract may be oral or written or implied contract also. The contract must be approved by all the parties. The contract should identify each person's rights, and the contract must have commercial substance. In the contract, the payment terms should be identified. That means the payment terms should be easily identifiable, and there is high probability of collecting the consideration. If all the conditions are satisfied, then the contract will be considered as enforceable contract. Step number 2, identify the separate performance obligations in the contract. Here, performance obligation means promises. We need to identify separate promises in the contract. Step number 3, determine the transaction price. Transaction price means the consideration that the entity is expecting to receive against the promises made. Transaction price includes contract price, that means agreed price, plus or minus some variable considerations also, and non-cash items also. Next, step number 4, allocate the transaction price to separate performance obligations based on standalone selling price. Step number 5, recognize revenue as and when the entity satisfies a performance obligation. Generally, revenue is recognized over the time or at the point in time. It will be recognized over the time in case of continuous supply of goods and services. Depending upon the progress of performance obligation, it will be recognized. It will be recognized at the point in time when control is passed to the customer immediately at a single point. In such a case, the revenue will be recognized immediately. So these are the 5 steps which are required to be cumulatively fulfilled in order to recognize the revenue as per Ind AS 115.